So the first topic that we want to discuss when it comes to online reputation is what I'm going to call the dynamics of seller reputation. And essentially, once you start getting negative reviews, what happens in terms of market transactions and potentially future reviews that we can see kind of coming online. So the idea is that, again, I've said a few times, I think that reputation mechanisms allow consumers to monitor firms. And the question we're really going after is, okay, if there's changes in seller reputation, how are consumers going to respond? And we're going to think about three metrics to kind of measure that response. That's going to be first, does it affect prices that the firm can get once their reviews change? We're going to focus on negative changes. The idea that you get more negative reviews. So if you get more negative reviews, does that impact your ability to charge a certain price or consumers' willingness to pay a certain price? How does it affect sales growth? So quantity sold over time. Third, does it affect subsequent reviews? So, does one negative review somehow start to bring about potentially a stream of negative reviews? Which, again, the more of those you get, the worse your online reputation is going to be. And then you're going to have to think as a firm, what might you want to do? Discussion for the next bunch of slides is going to come from Cabral and Hotescu. And that reading is on the reading list. So for further information, you should definitely go look there for what's going on. So the empirical approach of Cabral and Hotescu is to say, I'm going to go to the eBay platform and follow over time the sellers of 5 relatively homogeneous, sort of similar products. So they're going to think of, computers, teddy bears, and coins, and some other things. And what they're going to construct is a data set at the transaction level. So they're going to get all the transactions that occur over time, who's buying what and for how much, so quantities and prices. And they're also going to get the sequence of reviews for each seller that are left by the buyers. Their empirical approach, trying to understand this data that they now have on prices, quantities, and reviews, is going to be twofold. There's going to be a descriptive regression to summarize some of the associations between data. And then they're also going to look at differences in means. So how does the average sales or average price or things like that change over time? Importantly, this paper, none of what they're going to find are we going to be able to interpret necessarily or at all, let's say at all, as a causal effect. So it's just going to be an association between 2 variables. We're not going to be able to say because of A, definitely B. And that's just because of the empirical setup they have. They don't really have enough structure on their data, and they're not willing to make, I'm definitely also not willing to jump on board any kind of set of strong assumptions that let us make causal statements in their data. So the first thing they do is they're interested in the effect of reputation on price. So they run a regression of price as the Y variable on different reputation measures and some other things they think might be impacting demand. And table 2 in their paper, which I've got an excerpt of here, summarizes their main results. And what are they? So the first thing we want to take away from this table is that it does not appear to be a strong relationship, a strong association between negative comments and price. So the fact you're getting more negative comments or the percentage of negative comments is rising, that doesn't seem to influence price. I think this is important here because you think of eBay as an auction environment where I'm submitting bids as a consumer. those negative comments are not affecting necessarily my willingness to pay for a product. So that's important. What they do find though, which I'm going to look at column 5, which is the probability of a completed sale, or the number of completed sales. They find that there's weak, like at the 10% level of statistical significance, weak evidence that the number of sales goes down as the percentage of negative comments goes up. So it's not that consumers aren't willing to pay, it's that they're not willing to engage with you at all and want to make it and try and buy something from you. So they're just moving away and thinking about going somewhere else. And that's the main takeaway from this table. There's no association between negative reputation and price. There seems to be weak, or like not weak, but statistically significant at the 10% level evidence that more negative comments are going to be associated with lower sales numbers. So I think a more convincing way of thinking about how negative reputation might be impacting sales is what they do in table 3, where in the paper they're going to say, how does my sales growth evolve before I get my first ever negative comment, and compare that to after I get my first negative comment, what happened to sales? Growth, sales growth, not quantity, but growth in sales. So across these 4 categories that they display here, we see that the difference when you get your first negative comment, the difference in sales growth is really large. So for ThinkPad, so for computers, if we just read off that number of minus 12.74, what that's telling us is there's a 12.74% decrease after your first negative comment that's left on eBay. That's really large. So before, they were growing at 5.7%. And then after they get their negative one, their sales are growing by minus 7.5%. It's a really big change and strong evidence that negative feedback has impacts on sales and sales growth. The last metric that this paper talks about, which I think is important to understand, is the frequency that negative feedback arrives. So essentially, how long does it take for negative feedback to arrive? And after the first bit of negative feedback, do we see more, and do we see more negative feedback coming faster potentially than it was before? Again, this is really descriptive in nature. They look at, so T1 is going to be, I think, the time until the first negative comment. And T2 is going to be from the time you got your first, how many days until you get your second negative feedback. And what you see is for nearly all of these products, all of these product categories, that after you get your first one, the second one comes faster, right? So if we look at all categories, just as an average, first negative feedback seems to take 241. I'm pretty sure this is days. I'm going to interpret this as days. Whereas the second one comes in only 189 or 190 days. So that's 50 days faster, which is almost 2 months faster. So this is some evidence potentially that once you start getting negative feedback, it kind of opens the door to potentially more negative feedback. The mechanism through which that might happen is not entirely clear from the paper that they, when they write it. I think because they think there's 2 things going on. I'll talk about that about now. So there's 3 main findings in that paper that I think are important for us to know about online reputation. Decreases in online reputation don't seem to affect willingness to pay. What it's doing is it's decreasing consumers want to interact and want to buy from you as a product, want to buy a product from you. So this is the idea that sales growth declines rapidly with negative feedback. And that third finding was that negative feedback can seem to generate an increase in the amount of negative feedback over time. So it comes faster. And there's competing stories as to why that might be the case. One might be that once you say it, once the first negative comment comes up, it kind of opens the door to consumers feeling like it's okay to kind of really provide those negatives, and they come a little bit more often, which would be bad if you're a firm. But in the paper, the authors, Cabral and Hotowski, tell us that that might not be the only thing going on. So they think it's some idea of moral hazard, where once you start getting negative feedback as a firm, you start to care a little less and you put in a little bit less effort. So then you're more likely to get negative feedback in the future. So there's those two things going on, and they're not going to be able to separate that. So they're the main takeaways from that paper, essentially. It's not price, it's sales. And once you start to see negative feedback, there's potential that it's going to come more often.